consider. And I have observed that the malls that were established before, again, many of us were in office, are really serving a lot of different purposes. They've become very high intensity uses because they are not only retail destinations for the region, but they are also community spaces and they're places of worship. And I really wanted to commit to Councilmember Warsame and to others that I am interested in helping find other ways to meet those needs, because the zoning code tries to serve many purposes. One of them is to regulate the intensity of uses in different areas of the city. And in the industrial zoning classification, really, my interpretation, and I think staff's in the past interpretation of our zoning classifications for industrial do really not include the intensity of retail use that we're seeing in the malls. And then again, in addition to all of the other needs that they're serving. And so I think there are other ways that we need to work together to find a way to serve those needs within our community. So supporting Councilmember Warsame's motion. I didn't see any other desire for discussion. So all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? There are none, and that carries. So thank you for everyone who came to speak today. Then we'll just have a very brief presentation from staff on items 2 and 3. Again, I just wanted to give my colleagues a little more understanding of this, these couple pretty minor code updates, but
Okay. Good morning, council members. Councilmember Fry earlier this year introduced a zoning code text amendment that would allow for small-scale grain milling as a new use in the zoning code. Grain milling, typically, you think of the large facilities that you can see throughout Minneapolis, the A-Mill, the Washburn, the Pillsbury A-Mill, the Washburn A-Mill, Sarasota Elevator, and even active facilities like the General Mills establishment in Northeast Minneapolis. There's not an industrial standard in terms of what is small scale and large scale. A typical mill today produces approximately 1 million pounds of flour a day, and larger mills even more. The building size is large. We have a few active mills in Minneapolis, and their footprint is over 50. The average footprint is about 50,000 square feet, and the gross floor area much more than that. In the last 10 to 15 years throughout the U.S., there's been more specialty mills, and the flour production levels are well under 1% of what those large mills or those typical mills produce. And in research, the largest mill of these specialty establishments was 25,000 pounds per week. So once again, less than 1% of what a typical mill produces. And they're often associated with bakeries, on-site bakeries that mill the flour for use within the building. Currently, the Minneapolis zoning code only allows a grain elevator or mill as a conditional use in the general industrial district, the I-3, the most intense district. This text amendment would allow small-scale grain milling as a permitted use in all industrial districts and as a limited production use as part of Councilmember Gordon's text amendment in the commercial and downtown districts. And we're separating differentiating between small scale and large scale by establishing 5,000 square foot maximum for the small scale established grain mills. In the commercial and downtown districts, we're looking to maintain that the entrance open to a retail or office component and to have at least 15% of the space devoted to an office and commercial storefront. And this will help activate those storefronts in the commercial and downtown districts. So just briefly, going through the findings for the text amendment, what is the reason? Allows for bakeries to mail flour on site and help fill storefronts in commercial areas. What problem is the amendment designed to solve? The zoning code is currently really restrictive in terms of grain milling, and it's out of date in terms of grain milling and bakery trends. We feel that the text amendment will support homegrown Minneapolis and the city goals of being a hub of economic activity, innovation, and support of entrepreneurs. and likely create additional jobs. Do not see a problem created with the text amendment in terms of public safety, traffic, noise, and odor. There are a number of codes, both fire, building code requirements, food review, and electrical requirements that are in place today that weren't in place 100 years ago. And in checking in with our environmental services colleagues, large mills and elevators in Minneapolis have not been found to be an issue in terms of public safety or noise and odor. So finally, is the text amendment consistent with practices in surrounding areas? Yes. Other cities do limit large-scale mills to their intense industrial districts, but they do allow flexibility in terms of small-scale grain milling. A few examples found throughout the U.S. is in Pasadena, Griston Toll facility, Tabor Bread in Portland, the mill in San Francisco, and Baker Miller in Chicago. The impetus of the proposal is the food building at 1401 Marshall. Steve Horton and Tyrone Folliard, who are here today, if you do have questions for them, are proposing a small-scale grain milling facility here that would be connected with on-site bakery. And currently there's a charcuterie production facility and cheese establishment in the building. And I believe a restaurant, if it's not there now, will be opening up real soon. So I'll close there and answer questions you might have about the text amendment.
Any questions? Okay. Do you have a separate presentation for item 3?
My colleague.
Okay. All right. So I'll go ahead and move item 2 then and see if there's any discussion. Seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thanks for indulging. And I think it's important when we're doing these kind of policy. We have a lot of discussion of these kind of small amendments. I like people to know what we're doing in our policy work as well. Okay. So then very quickly, we'll move to item number 3.
So there are some parallels between this amendment and the one that Aaron just talked about. But essentially there are 3 components to the amendment that is before you for item number 3. So this amendment looks, first of all, at limited production and processing uses. Right now, limited production and processing is limited to 1,200 square feet in our zoning code, and it's a conditional use in our commercial districts. Most of the small-scale food and beverage uses, the microbreweries, those more small startup type incubator uses that are showing up in the commercial districts are classified as limited production and processing. So if you've got a microbrewery, a winery, we've had a chocolate manufacturer, small scale bakery, that sort of thing, that's been considered limited production and processing. So each of those has required a conditional use permit. And we've also been varying that maximum of 1,200 square feet on several of these uses. So the proposal would expand the size limitation to 5,000 square feet and also make it a permitted use in the commercial districts. And we've looked at the specific development standards, which would maintain regulation over offsite impacts like noise, dust, odors, that sort of thing. This amendment also looks more generally at the size of commercial uses. So in the OR districts, the office residence districts, right now, commercial uses in those districts are limited to small-scale neighborhood serving retail sales and service uses. Those uses are limited to a maximum of 2,000 square feet. You can only have 2 per building. The building has to be 2 stories and at least 20,000 square feet in area. The combination of those limitations make the OR2 district a hard fit for a lot of the development projects that we're seeing. It's a good transitional district to provide between low density residential and some of our higher intensity commercial uses, or for uses to be located on community corridors and other less intense commercial areas. So what we're proposing to do with the OR districts is to expand the size of a single commercial use from 2,000 square feet to 4,000. To get rid of the limitation on the maximum of 2 uses, and to also get rid of the building square footage. The minimum right now is 20,000 square feet. Looking at what we have for OR2 zone parcels, there are several parcels that are less than 10,000 square feet in area, and that 20,000 square foot minimum for building GFA would mean that if you put a commercial use in those parcels, it would have to be more than 2 stories. So we're eliminating that. The commercial uses would still have to be in the ground floor of a 2-story building, and it's still limited to those neighborhood serving retail sales and service type uses. And then finally, we're looking at commercial sizes generally across the board in our commercial districts. In the last 10 years or so, we've processed 18 variances to the size of commercial uses to increase it in our commercial districts. Of those, we've approved 17 of them. So we're looking at some pretty incremental changes in our smaller scale, the C1 district. The C2 district we're not touching because that's already pretty generous as far as what it allows for commercial uses. And then in C3A, our community activity center district, we're increasing the size of commercial uses allowed and then also adding a third bonus category for large mixed use buildings. Buildings that are at least 100,000 square feet in area would be eligible to have a commercial use that's up to 20,000 square feet, which would be the maximum in that district. So I can certainly stand for questions if there are any.
Thank you. Are there any questions for staff? I'll just note we did have some discussion at Planning Commission about, we often hear a desire for smaller commercial spaces, but given the pattern that we have been seeing and the fact that most of the variances have been meeting the needed standards for the variance to be granted, we were supportive of this policy change. So I will move this item. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. Thank you. That carries. And then we'll bring us to our final item regarding overnight and emergency shelters.
Good morning, council members. I am the staff person who was assigned to overnight shelters, looking at a zoning code text amendment that was introduced by council members Bender and Gordon last December. Presently, to allow for a new overnight shelter, you have to either be located in the downtown shelter overlay district or within an existing place of assembly or religious institution. So we started this study in April of this year, and we organized a steering committee where we looked at several of the existing operations and met with operators, nonprofit organizations, community members, kind of define the boundaries of what we think some of the implementation should be of this new policy. As part of that steering committee, we also had the Office for Ending Homelessness present, and they joined us in two of our 3 community meetings. So I have a couple slides here that just give some general statistics about who are the homeless in Minneapolis. Generally speaking, we have just over 2,100 people in emergency shelter in the last 12 months. You'll see the breakdown there of family, single, and youth. And then the last unsheltered count, which was June of this year, was just over 200. We accommodate our homeless in a variety of different land uses in the city of Minneapolis. We have board and care facilities. We have supportive housing that provide homeless shelter beds. We have one principal shelter, and then we also have several of our accessory overnight shelters located in religious institutions. Here again, there's some statistics around the quantities based on family. So this would be total for Hennepin County. You'll see a breakdown of the facilities here on the right based on how many people. And then so averaging between 375 and 250 families over the course of a year. Those are the highs and lows. And then single adults between 1,000 and over 750. And then total people, and this is Hennepin County, and then also a breakdown. And this is based on youth, adults breakdown. Those are broken out. Here's some demographic information about who our homeless are by percentage and how many are from Minneapolis and how many of them have serious or chronic disability. So in addition to organizing our steering committee, which met 3 times, we also had a homeless shelter forum where we were able to meet with homeless individuals at the Harbor Light facility. We understood some of their concerns and how important transit really is to locating any new shelter. And then finally, we had 3 community outreach meetings. We sent out information to all of the neighborhood associations and tweeted it out. And we had an ongoing website that's still active today, informing the general public of how they can be involved in this text amendment, provide feedback, and be engaged in this process. Through those community meetings, we found some underlying themes. First and foremost was regulating concentration and making sure that we don't have all of the new shelters located in one particular area. Then also being able to provide smaller shelters. So we looked at maybe opening up the opportunity and more of zoning classifications throughout the city of Minneapolis. Making sure that there's accountability for operators, and also brainstorming ideas on how we can reduce some livability crime near some shelters. So in addition to the public outreach, we also worked with our internal colleagues in development services and CPED, particularly with plan review. And plan review reviews all building permits for compliance with our building life and safety ordinances. The important distinction between an overnight shelter and maybe something more like a supportive housing or residential use is that because the stay is less than 30 days, they are required to make upgrades to existing construction or build to new construction the same way that they would for a hotel or motel. So it has to meet certain fire egress requirements. It has to meet accessibility and additional requirements there. So I know that we had met with many concerned citizens who thought perhaps that people would be taking over a lot of existing single-family dwellings, for example, converting them to shelters. It's a possibility. However, at a certain point will be cost prohibitive. So through the process, we determined that we really needed two different classifications for shelters. One is the emergency shelter, and this would be a facility that's typically a smaller size facility. It would be regulated based on occupancy depending upon the zoning classification, and a stay would be allowed up to 30 days. This is consistent with our Housing First model, which is a national model for allowing people to stay in place for a little longer period of time to allow folks to maybe work on some of the circumstances where they found themselves homeless. The second type of land use is consistent with how we define overnight shelter today, which is a facility that allows for temporary stay for less than 24 hours. And these, in our mind, and you'll see in the land use regulations, would be more of a larger facility. Here's just kind of a breakdown. So this, again, would allow for these types of shelters to be a principal use. It would be the only use required on the property. It wouldn't be required to be accessory to a religious institution as it is today. So you'll see that emergency shelters, as proposed, would be allowed in all zoning districts, with the exception of industrial, where we would not normally allow residential anyway. Both types would require, or I should say, all three types would require a conditional use permit. Occupancy, as I mentioned, for emergency shelters would be based on the zoning district. Occupancy for overnight shelters, staff is recommending 150 people or the building code, whichever is less. So if the space would not allow for that many people, of course, by the building code, we would go with a lesser number. And then we would continue to allow for overnight shelters accessory to religious institutions and places of assembly. And this is exactly how we currently regulate it. There's only one small change there, which I'll cover here in just a moment. So as I mentioned, emergency shelters are intended to be a smaller facility. Your maximum occupancy is either 6, 16, or 32 persons, depending upon your zoning classification. And that kind of follows in line with your low density, medium density, and high density districts. We'd be requiring a minimum spacing requirement to avoid concentration. For zoning concentration, we have very limited tools, and so spacing was really our only option. Staff determined that 1,000 feet was appropriate. This is consistent with what we currently allow in the Downtown Shelter Overlay District. And again, we would have a conditional use permit, so that's a public hearing process. Here's a map that shows, generally speaking, where based on gradient, and it's really tied to zoning classifications, low, medium, and high, where we would allow emergency shelters, and then with that gradient is based on occupancy. You'll see here that we also included all of our existing overnight shelters, both accessory and principal, and the spacing requirements. So those, we have a good idea of where the properties are. The second land use that we have redefined and are suggesting would be allowed in the C2, C4, downtown, and industrial living overlay and the downtown shelter overlay districts. Again, requiring a conditional use permit, maximum occupancy 150, or whatever the building code, whichever's less. Now, the downtown shelter overlay presently allows up to 350 occupants. We're not proposing any changes to the downtown shelter overlay. And this covers everything I just said. So here's a map showing the eligible areas for overnight shelters. So again, these in staff's mind would be allowed for a larger facility just based on occupancy. When we looked at the different zoning districts where we thought this land use would be appropriate, we found that these classifications as identified would at least allow for a new overnight shelter in all of the 13 wards. So we wouldn't hopefully avoid further concentration. I mean, you can see here on the map that we do have general concentration in a couple areas on the map, but we do have additional corridors that would allow for a new overnight shelter. And accessory overnight shelters, the only thing we added was a provision that if the existing place of assembly were to close and we have a shelter that's in operation, and we have people that are depending upon those services, that they would be allowed to continue as the conditional use would have permitted them previously. And that, unless discontinued, and that would again be consistent with how we handle conditional uses in the city of Minneapolis. And here's a map showing all of the existing accessory uses that would be able to take advantage of that provision. So if that place of assembly were to close, anywhere you see in purple on this map, they would be allowed to continue to operate. Here are just the specific development standards. The only thing we haven't talked about are things about new construction and additions being compatible, making sure we have an appropriate transition area, requiring that enclosed shelter area or enclosed waiting area prior to the opening or taking in shelter guests by appointment only, requiring a management plan, including a floor plan showing sleeping areas, emergency exits, bathrooms, and then making sure that litter is cleaned up on the property and within 100 feet of the property. And this is consistent with overnight shelters, except just the occupancy changes there. Staff is proposing a limited off-street parking requirement. We did not want to see, for example, in an emergency shelter where we would require something like one off-street parking space per bed, where we're over-parking the site. So instead, we've said that no minimum off-street parking for an emergency shelter, and the maximum would be one space per bed. For the overnight shelter, just because we would want to take a look more holistically at the building as a whole, understand who the intended occupants would be of that particular shelter, and we would want to determine that parking through the conditional use permit. That concludes all of the regulations as proposed. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for staff? I want to note we've been joined by Councilmember Gordon. Go off for a minute. Councilmember Sami, that will. Here's your one. That's all. Okay. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had the opportunity to meet with staff yesterday. I'm obviously very familiar with this issue since the vast majority of the shelters are in my ward. I can say with a fairly good degree of certainty, it's just not that big of a deal, especially the emergency shelter at First Covenant that I think they've done a very good job with and has not really been rejected by the neighborhood as the kind of shelter that it is. But I've also worked with 1010 Curry Catholic Charities as well as the supportive housing services in that area. And you know, despite the fact that folks like to beat up on the facilities for not kind of controlling the situation enough, it would be more uncontrolled if people were living underneath a bridge, which is also happening. You know, kind of from where I sit, and probably where Councilmember Versami and Fry sit, we're like, go for it, man. Take them out of our ward and put them into somebody else's ward. So that's why I think it's important to say that this is really not going to be that dramatic. We have a spacing requirement in the downtown shelter overlay district. I would hope that we wouldn't be putting something one block outside of that. I do think spacing is critically important, especially in neighborhoods like Elliott Park and Whittier that have taken their unfair share, I think, and I represent a neighborhood that's taken its unfair share. But I think this is a good step forward to figure out what happens next. Because ultimately, I think we have to just accept the fact that if people are not housed, they're going to be homeless or in shelter, and we have to kind of try to do better in figuring that out. I'm not going to make the motion because it's not my ordinance. It's Councilmember Bender's, and she's the chair. So out of respect for her, I won't do that.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. I will go ahead and move approval of the policy, and I'd love to hear from Councilmember Gordon.
Well, thank you very much. And I did want to take a moment to thank council colleagues for help working on this and also staff. It was actually about a year ago, I think, when we introduced this. So we certainly took a lot of time, had a lot of community engagement and involvement. I even got to go to neighborhood organizations that are outside with Award 2 to make presentations about the project and clarify some questions. The one thing that I also wanted to mention is that there is a companion ordinance that I'm moving forward through the health code to create a license for the emergency shelters and potentially the larger overnight shelters. We're still discussing that. This would be something that would be handled through the health department, where we also do the licenses for motels and lodging establishments. So we're just looking at some basic safety and health accommodations that we would expect from any emergency shelter. I think this will also give us another layer of oversight in addition to the conditional use permit. My hope was that it would be timed well so we could pass it at the same council meeting as we're passing this, but we haven't held the public hearing yet, so that will probably come forward in January.
Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Generally supportive of this. I do have some issues that I'll talk offline with staff regarding. I appreciate that industrial districts are not included in this, though industrial districts with an overlay are, and so I'm going to have some offline conversation about that. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just take the opportunity then to thank everyone who got involved in this conversation, which has been going on for a year. I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to serve on Heading Home Hennepin, which is a long time partnership between the city and the county focused on the maybe unattainable but lofty goal of ending homelessness. And that has benefited from the leadership of Commissioners Callison and Green, Mayor Hodges, Councilmember Quincy, and many others. Everyone's goal is to house people, and Councilmember Goodman and others on the council have worked on that for a long time. But the reality is that people now need shelter. And there are so many wonderful people in the city of Minneapolis working very hard every day. The often thankless work, I think, of providing shelter for those people and the services that they need. There are also people who are making really terrible choices because they're given the choice of sleeping outside or finding another way to provide themselves with a place to sleep at night. And I think that's particularly happening with women in our city, where we have very few numbers of beds for women, but not just that population. So, this is one small change that we can make. We're not going to solve homelessness through the zoning code text amendment, but we are addressing something that the city directly controls and something that we can do about today. Councilmember Gordon and I know that this is a sensitive issue in many of our neighborhoods, and particularly in the 10th Ward, where we have 2 existing shelters. I know I have constituents who are really concerned about some of the impacts of those shelters, and we've worked really hard to address those, and my commitment is to continue to work with my constituents on those shelters in my ward. I also see so many of my constituents and neighbors of shelters across the city getting involved and volunteering at the shelters and helping provide services to those who are in need. And we heard a lot of really amazing stories about that during the public outreach process, including one where a new shelter had located in a neighborhood. The neighborhood organization organized a tour to talk about the impacts on neighbors. And the people who attended ended up more concerned about the people within the shelter and the conditions that they were in, because they didn't have beds. They were sleeping on mats. So the neighborhood actually ended up getting involved in trying to improve the conditions within the shelter for the people who were being served. And I think we will see that, because I have seen commitment from, and the folks who testified at the Planning Commission who operate our shelters really made a point to stress how important it is for them to be good neighbors and to engage the community around the shelters. Our goal here was to allow for this update to our code to decouple shelters from religious institutions. It really reflects the reality of the funding of today's shelters. It addresses concerns from our LGBT community and others who have not felt comfortable seeking service from those shelters tied to religious institutions. And it proposes a policy that doesn't concentrate shelters in one location. We considered actually looking at more zoning classifications, lower intensity commercial uses or higher density residential uses, but we are bringing forward what's a more moderate proposal, more of a compromise. And again, Councilmember Gordon's parallel policy change regarding licenses is aimed at addressing the conditions inside the shelters as well as making sure everyone is safe. So again, thanks so much to staff for taking on this challenging issue and bringing forward such a thoughtful proposal. I'm thankful for the supportive comments of my colleagues and see if there's any further discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries. That's our final item today, and we are adjourned.